we're in this window where it's not required quite yet to provide the disclosure on how management and the board think about climate-related risk, nor does the SEC rule sort of require the board or management to think about it in any particular way, but they have to tell their story. And so what I'm advising companies to do is sort of that no regret action is, write out what would it look like if I had to disclose? Because again, we're in this narrow window right now where you have the opportunity to adjust if you don't like the story that it tells.
Joining me today is Lauren Pesa, Partner, Real Estate Sustainability, Climate and Equity Leader with Deloitte. Lauren, thanks so much for joining us again.
Thank you for having me.
Now, here at REITworks, you're on a panel focused on the much anticipated SEC proposed climate rule. Can you start by giving us your latest expectations and understanding of when and what we should expect?
Oh goodness, well, I certainly don't have a crystal ball, but the SEC just updated their regulatory agenda, and right now it states October. That doesn't mean that October will be the date, so it really could be any day now. Now, there are a number of sort of forces at play that could influence that date. We saw literally, I think it was this past Monday, that the ISSB issued their first sustainability standards. We've got obviously CSRD, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive out of the European Union. So there's all these sort of standards and regulations that are being finalized, and what we understand is that the SEC is looking to find what we call interoperability, so that folks that are having to sort of tackle multiple regulations and standards at the same time that have overlap. These other standards and regulations also have climate implications, that they can find as much synergy as possible, so that folks that have multiple regulations to contend with can kind of do it holistically rather than sort of tackling them in silos.
What are some no-regret actions that REITs can do now to prepare for whenever this rule eventually comes?
Yes. So because there are so many other regulations and standards, I just talked about some that are occurring internationally. We also have the state of California that is looking at some potential regulations that's going to require climate-related risk as well as greenhouse gas emissions disclosures. We see the federal government, if you're a federal supplier, which is very easy to meet these thresholds, that will also require some greenhouse gas emissions disclosures as well as climate-related risk. That what is embodied in both of those regulations plus the SEC, there's really two items that I tell companies are no regret actions right now. And the first is a large portion of all of those regulations is premised on the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, or TCFD. And so while the SEC's rule is sort of TCFD on steroids, I'm suggesting companies as they sort of mature to get to the full compliance with that regulation to start with TCFD. So many REITs are already preparing under that framework today, but that really is an opportunity to sort of get ready and tell your story. And I also say, there's a lot of disclosure in there that talks about how the board and management think about climate-related risk. And so we're in this window where it's not required quite yet to provide the disclosure on how management and the board think about climate-related risk, nor does the SEC rule sort of require the board or management to think about it in any particular way, but they have to tell their story. And so what I'm advising companies to do is sort of that no regret action is, write out what would it look like if I had to disclose? Because again, we're in this narrow window right now where you have the opportunity to adjust if you don't like the story that it tells. So that's a no regret action. And then I'd also say Scope 1 and Scope 2 are likely to be inevitable outcomes of this. So get ready, do your greenhouse gas emissions inventory, gives you some time to work through the bugs, figure out your data sourcing strategy. And then finally, I think Scope 3 is going to come down one way or another. So at a minimum, do an assessment of what will likely be relevant in those categories. So maybe don't go as far as to measure what's in Scope 3, but at least kind of have a clear picture of what you may need to get, and also that data sourcing strategy. Okay, if I had to get it tomorrow, what does that look like? So those are really the two no regret actions. And I think just holistically having a comprehensive plan, because we're getting right, there's a lot of focus on SEC, and I understand that's a big one, but it can also be distracting. There's a lot of different regulations that have an SEC or an ESG flavor right now. So take a look at, what jurisdictions you operate in, and figure out, okay, what regulations that are either final or proposed am I going to have to contend with in that environment.
Great. And finally, what are some leading practices REITs can take to integrate their controllership functions and sustainability functions to prepare for ESG to move from voluntary to this required reporting?
Yeah, so it's a really interesting environment right now, because our sustainability professionals have been working on this in some cases a number of years, decade plus. And now we're moving to sort of a regulated environment where the information there's going to be a lot more rigor that's required around the regulation. And I'm seeing what the reality is that there's some tension often occurring at the companies that I speak to between their sustainability and controllership function. And because I think controllership just has a different sort of mindset around, again, the rigor, et cetera, of data. But both parties are necessary to ultimately mobilize and get this, behemoth of a mandate done. And listen, what I say to my controllership friends is that this is a different risk paradigm. So what folks were doing in the voluntary space wasn't necessarily wrong. It just was a different level of risk. Now we've shifted that, and it's a much riskier environment that we're in. And so you really do need to merge those capabilities together. Now, what I'm encouraging folks to do is really become bilingual, right? So enable sustainability to speak the language of controllership, and enable the controllership function to speak the language of sustainability, because you're going to need both parties to be at the table. And in this space and time that we're in, we are in a narrow window to really set the tone and tenor of that engagement and collaboration, right? But you're going to need both parties. You're going to need the subject matter expertise that the sustainability professionals bring. And then you're going to need that sort of history and grammar associated with regulated reporting that controllership has been doing for years. So that really, I think, is critical to enabling this to be a successful, it's certainly going to be challenging, but a successful implementation.